You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz. I am also recording from Washington, D.C.
Hey, Katie, it's a beautiful spring week here in D.C. How are you doing today?
It is absolutely lovely.
And I guess as things are getting warmer here in Washington, they are also heating up in the Indo-Pacific. Sorry, that was a terrible segue, but hopefully our listeners will forgive me. But we do have a few items on the agenda today. We're going to do a bit of a mixed bag discussion here today, in that, as we sometimes like to do on the Asia Geopolitics podcast, we're going to jump regions a little bit. It's been a while since Katie and I have covered developments in Central Asia, so we'll talk briefly about the geopolitical significance in the region of a new set of U.S. sanctions pertaining to Russia's war against Ukraine. Katie will walk us through the implications there. And then we'll move over a bit to talk about new developments in the Taiwan Strait. We can't seem to get away from the Taiwan Strait on the Asia Geopolitics podcast, which is, of course, entirely unsurprising in 2023. But we'll talk a bit about Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's meeting with U.S. Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy and the ensuing fallout. And, of course, as has been the talk of many folks on Twitter, the meltdown over French President Emmanuel Macron's comments on stability in the Taiwan Strait. So, Katie, we got a lot on the agenda. I'm just going to cut right to the chase and turn it over to you to give us a bit of an update on these new U.S. sanctions and the implications for the Central Asian region, specifically Uzbekistan, and what exactly are we taking away here from this latest development?
Okay, yeah. So this week, the U.S. and the U.K. have added additional sanctions targeting, quote, Russian financial facilitators and sanctions evaders, which is how the U.S. Treasury Department put it. And these target, on the UK side, Roman Abramovich and Alisher Usmanov. On the US side, mostly Alisher Usmanov. Those who are not familiar with the world's billionaires, Alisher Usmanov is a Russian Uzbek billionaire. He's a dual citizen. He is estimated to be worth at least 19.5 billion, one of the world's super rich. And these new sanctions, so both of these personally, but the new sanctions on the US side and the British side target their businesses. Usmanov has a 49% stake in a company called USM Holding, which owns a whole bunch of other companies, including Metallo Invest, which is a major steel producer in Russia, Megafon, which is one of Russia's largest telecoms, and dozens of other companies. And so these new sanctions hit those companies specifically, which is a change from earlier editions of sanctions that targeted Usmanov personally. These now extend into his business interests, including his family members, through which he allegedly moves money. And this is particularly important because Usmanov is a very important figure in Uzbekistan, especially now. When Shavkat Mirziyoyev became president in 2016, Usmanov was sort of welcomed back in. Islam Karimov didn't really like oligarchs all that much. They made him nervous. Mirziyoyev really embraced Usmanov, and he has made a lot of investments in Uzbekistan. On the list of companies that have been targeted with sanctions, most of them are Russia-based, but at least one of them is an Uzbekistan-based business, which sort of brings to life a concern that has circulated around Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, that Central Asian businesses and Central Asian money will be targeted by sanctions because of Russia, and this is now happening.
So is the interpretation in the region, I don't know if we have reactions from the region so far, is the idea that the dam has sort of broken now and that nobody in Central Asia can really count themselves safe if they're doing business at a significant scale in Russia?
So this is interesting because back in November, the Financial Times carried a story in which they reported that Uzbek government officials in meetings with European officials were trying to get Usmanov out from under these sanctions. And the Uzbek government case allegedly was that these sanctions are preventing Usmanov from investing in Uzbekistan. In Europe, don't you want more investment in Uzbekistan? It clearly that argument hasn't really gone anywhere. Certainly from the US and the British and the European perspective, Usmanov is a Russian oligarch. He has very close ties to Putin. He has very close ties to Mirziyoyev as well. And his money is part of why the Russian economy continues to churn on. And so I think these sanctions are intended to do what sanctions are intended to do, which is put pressure on the Russian government to cease its war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, in terms of the practical effect here, where do you think the primary incidence of these sanctions is going to be? Is this primarily going to end up hurting Central Asian economies if this continues, or do you think this is really going to be marginal in the grand scheme of things?
I think at this point it's going to be marginal in the grand scheme. Only one of the companies from the list that I read from State Department and Treasury
Mm-hmm.
in the United States was based in Uzbekistan. But the threat remains real that there could be other companies that are targeted if they're being used by people like Usmanov to sort of skirt existing sanctions. And so it certainly, I think, will be worrying the rich in Tashkent. But at this point, I think we'll have a larger impact in Russia because that is still where the bulk of Usmanov's money and his business interests are based.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's one thing I want to note before I take us to Taiwan.
Sure.
The USM Holdings sent me a press release or a response to the sanctions, and obviously said that these are unjust. Usmanov doesn't run the company. All of this is unfair. But they also took sort of particular umbrage at the fact that these sanctions are targeting people like his sister and one of his stepsons. But and this is one of the sneaky billionaire tricks, which is where you put a bank account in your sister, your wife's name, and then funnel millions of dollars through it. And you can say it's not my money, it's her money. But I think that's a farce, and the U.S. government is sort of calling it out for what it is by sanctioning these family members. The company likened it to hostage taking, which I thought was pretty galling, given that there are actual hostages who have been taken by the Russian government. But that's neither here nor there. But the family connection is also a very Central Asian way of doing business.
Absolutely.
But I think, yeah, so that's something worth watching still too, is these networks. But let's switch to the other side of the world. Tsai was in the U.S. Briefly in the last, I guess it was over a week ago. She was in New York, and then she was in, I guess it was Los Angeles. Ankit, tell me a little bit about these stopovers and what the sort of response from China was to them, and then we can eventually wind our way towards Macron and his mouth.
Yeah, sure. So definitely, I think worth talking about. And first of all, this was kind of, I think, foreseen the moment turn of the House of Representatives changed over after the U.S. midterm elections and Republicans took control. Listeners will, of course, recall the visit that Speaker Pelosi made to Taiwan last year in August, which we covered extensively on this podcast and at the Diplomat more broadly, resulted in unprecedented types of Chinese kinetic shows of force, including literally flying multiple missiles over Taiwanese territory, with some missiles landing in Japan's EEZ, large-scale exercises, exclusion zones, cutting off U.S.-China exchanges. So Kevin McCarthy, who's the current House Speaker, effectively wanted to have his own meeting with Tsai Ing-wen. Of course, McCarthy did not travel to Taiwan, which I think was primarily why we saw the kind of reaction we did last time when Pelosi went, which was, of course, the first visit by a speaker in a long time. But this time, Tsai met McCarthy on U.S. soil on the West Coast. I don't know how much of a difference that actually makes, but further from Washington, D.C., the better in this case. And the meeting basically was a show of congressional support for Taiwan, as these things go. Fairly standard fare. Tsai delivered comments on, democracy being under threat around the world. McCarthy called on China not to retaliate for the meeting, saying that he's the Speaker of the House and that he won't listen to China. He'll meet with whoever he sees fit to meet with. And of course, I think there's also an element, I think, of partisan deniability here for the Biden administration. One of the perceived problems, at least during Pelosi's visit, was that Biden's a Democrat, Pelosi's a Democrat. Can't Biden just tell Pelosi not to go to Taiwan? And of course, with separation of government in the United States, and of course, Pelosi being in the legislative branch, that's not how things work. But I think for the Chinese side, there was a perception that the Biden administration was actively egging on, or at least not displeased by Pelosi's visit. And I think here that's, again, an element that's missing, given that McCarthy is a Republican who's choosing to go ahead with this meeting. And so all of this kind of brings us then to the reaction from China, which was severe. I'm not trying to underrate it at all, but I think compared to the kind of reaction we saw to Pelosi's visit, this was relatively more muted. That said, it was not insignificant by any means. China carried out carrier-based aviation exercises to Taiwan's east for the first time. J-15 carrier-borne fighters were deployed in these exercises. The PLA's Eastern Theater Command also carried out mock strikes on Taiwanese territory. They also released a computer animation showing multiple missiles being launched from the Chinese mainland and striking multiple targets in Taiwan. Very subtle, the stuff that wins over hearts and minds, but that's how China played this. And I think that's broadly brings us, Katie, then to sort of, this idea of a new normal in the Taiwan Strait that we talked about after Pelosi's visit. One of the things that changed was the cadence and the types of activities that China carries out with its military forces in the Taiwan Strait, now east of Taiwan, has certainly changed, right? The median line, which was never particularly sacrosanct, but had slowly been chipped away through a process of salami slicing, has effectively now ceased to be a meaningful threshold. The Taiwanese Air Force regularly now scrambles to intercept PLA fighters that cross the median line, fighters, bombers, and other military transport aircraft. And so this, I think, is broadly playing into that that trend. And I think, broadly speaking, of course, this is taking place after Balloon Gate and the precipitous decline in U.S. China relations as a result of that. So all things considered, little good news here, but more, I think, indicators that China is still going to be committed to these kinds of shows of force to retaliate for perceived shows of support by the United States towards Taiwan that Beijing interprets to be out of line with what the United States has committed to in the 3 communiques and the U.S. One China policy.
So I have a question, Ankit.
Sure.
What do you make of the somewhat parallel trip of Ma Ying-jeou to Tsai's predecessor as Taiwanese leader, his trip to mainland China? I think that got less coverage than Tsai's trip to the United States, even though it was a more, I think, serious trip. But I'm curious what your thoughts on that dynamic are.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's a significant one, right? I mean, we get into questions of Taiwanese domestic politics and the perceived move in the mainland that the DPP is slowly but surely taking Taiwan towards independence, which of course is not the official policy of the Tsai administration, but broadly speaking, the DPP can fairly be described as independence-leaning. There are certainly members of the DPP who would be more pro-independence than Tsai personally is. Tsai is rather careful about the terminology that she uses, for instance, to describe Taiwan's status and relationship with China. But Ma Ying-jeou, as the former president and member of the Kuomintang Party, the Nationalist Party, his visit was feted in China, right? I mean, it was a propaganda coup. The strong emphasis was Chineseness, right? This idea that Ma's visit could be presented to the Chinese people and potentially to the world, at least through the Chinese press, as a reminder that China and Taiwan are both effectively Chinese. And that was, I think, the primary symbolism of that visit. I think at the end of the day, we're going to have to see how much this is going to do to actually shift the narratives within Taiwanese politics on how Taiwan should relate to the mainland. The long-running trend in Taiwan that the DPP, of course, is benefiting from is the process of Taiwanization, particularly among the youth, where a distinct Taiwanese identity as distinct from a broader Chinese identity that sort of bridges across the Taiwan Strait is where things have been heading in Taiwan. And I don't really see that reversing.
All right. Well, I think we've come to the hottest question on Twitter right now. What was Macron thinking when he said that about Taiwan?
Well, I mean, there's the matter of what exactly he said. And, there's been some back and forth about translation problems, but I speak French. I lived in Paris for several years, and my interpretation is that, basically the translations got it right. I mean, Macron, he has these moments when he generates controversy. He's done this. I mean, I guess it primarily happens when he's trying to, extend an olive branch to authoritarian regimes. This happened with Putin prior to the Ukraine invasion, and now I guess it's happening with Xi Jinping in China. But, this idea that security in the Taiwan Strait is effectively not a central interest for France, and that France should be that Europe should chart its own path and not blindly follow the United States. It's very French. It's very kind of de Gaulle in that way. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, on de Gaulle, France was the first Western country to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China in 1964, and so that's sort of an interesting historical parallel here. I think Macron's comments have been since massaged and walked back by French bureaucrats. It's been really interesting to sort of watch, not really damage control, because everybody's saying, everybody in France is saying that Macron stands by what he said, and there's since been sort of clarifications that France continues to support the status quo. But I think it does create some confusion, right? Because we've talked about France's role in the Indo-Pacific before on this podcast, and the French talking point is always that France is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. And so Macron's comments that, Europe should not get caught up in crises that are not ours, I think directly cuts against that idea that crises in the Indo-Pacific, where France is supposedly a resident. France has more exclusive economic zone in the Indo-Pacific than any other country, which is, of course, an artifact of French colonial possessions, but nevertheless, that is part of the justification for French presence in the region. I think it creates confusion. It blurs, I think, clear deterrent messaging towards Beijing. So broadly speaking, I think it's fair to describe, this as a net negative for unified Western messaging. I think broadly what's happening here, though, is that, we are seeing some grappling with Europe's sense of strategic autonomy in an environment where I think the EU especially, since Brexit also is broadly coping with a relative decline vis-a-vis the United States, economically, militarily. And so that, I think, reflects this call for strategic autonomy. This Macron controversy also reminds me of a few years ago when he described NATO as being, quote, brain dead. And so it's just this classic Macron moment. But longer term, I think this is going to be a blip on the radar. I don't think this is going to be a fundamental turning point in how France approaches the region. I think the cleanup that's happened after Macron's comments kind of indicates that. But nevertheless, I think it's a revealing and interesting moment about the dynamics and anxieties at play in how France thinks about its role in the Indo-Pacific, and might be somewhat confused, I guess, based on how President Macron talks about it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent sort of analysis of the Asia piece in that question. What I found particularly interesting was the Eastern European reaction to this. Sort of could probably be summed up as like, why are you insulting the United States right now when we need their partnership so much regarding Ukraine? And I think that was sort of an interesting kind of tension within Europe. It was sort of, what universe are you living in right now, Macron? Like, now is not the time. But it was sort of a bit of traditional French, like, independence, maybe showing its flag.
Yeah, and which, by the way, I think I saw a few funny, tongue-in-cheek reactions from friends in Australia who made the point that Macron's comments were exactly the vindication that Australia needed for AUKUS, which I thought was a funny spin on the controversy.
Yeah.
But in any case, Katie, I think we'll wrap it there today, and certainly, no shortage of developments to come in the region. So we'll be back with more soon. But thanks a lot for, first of all, sharing your insights on Central Asia, which is always terrific, and for kicking around these ideas on Taiwan.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for chatting.
Great. For our listeners, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. Yeah, you can do that wherever you get your podcasts, and we really appreciate that feedback. And as always, if you have suggestions for content on future episodes that you'd like to hear Katie and I go over, please do reach out to either of us. We're very happy to take that into consideration as we plan. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.